Okay, I'm excited now to introduce our speaker. I was out birding a number of years ago when I first met tonight's speaker, Ryan O'Donnell. We were in Logan, Utah, where Ryan had just moved to get his PhD in ecology from Utah State University. I was moving at the time from Logan to here. While at Utah State, Ryan actually looked at all those color forms of dark-eyed juncos and became an authority on their many subtypes and intergrades. Ryan would have helped me be a better birder had I stayed in Logan. In a birding group, Ryan can help others take photos, spot birds, and keep an accurate count all at the same time. I've been with him, I testify. He's also a fabulous photographer, including taking photos of many rarities from his time up on St. Paul Island in Alaska. He's now a senior research biologist with the Arizona Game and Fish. He's been chasing critters since he was old enough to walk and doing it professionally for 18 years. His research specializes on the distribution of non-game vertebrates with a particular affinity for rare amphibians and reptiles. His current and recent work includes projects on the distribution of the Mexican garter snake, monitoring methods for frogs, and inventories of the amphibians and reptiles of military installations. So, Brian, thank you for coming. Welcome to Prescott.
Again, I'm Ryan O'Donnell. I'm with the Wildlife Contracts branch at Arizona Game and Fish. And I'm going to start there because I think a lot of people might not even know what that is or what that means. The Wildlife Contracts branch, we don't work specifically with one group of organisms. We don't do a lot of development. We focus specifically on collaborating with other agencies. So all of our projects are funded by other agencies like the military, like the Forest Service, like the Bureau of Land Management, rarely sometimes private entities as well, but most of our work is in collaboration with and funded by other agencies. The project I'm going to talk about today is no exception to that. This is a collaboration with the US Marine Corps that I've been working on for the last 2 years. We've been working specifically on the Berry Goldwater Range, and before I get into kind of what we found and how we found it, I'm going to give you a little background on that. The Berry Goldwater Range is a huge military installation. You might know about it already. It's 1.9 million acres. That makes it the second largest military installation in the US. It's managed jointly by the Air Force and the Marine Corps. It follows kind of the south side of I-8 all the way from Yuma past Gila Bend. So if you're driving from here to Yuma, if you went down kind of through the Phoenix way, it's like on the left side of the road for like the last several hours. Like it's a pretty large place. The Goldwater Range together, if it were a state, it would bump Rhode Island off the list of the top 50 largest states. It's almost as big as Connecticut. And it's really uniquely located. Because it's adjacent to Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, and Pinacate in Mexico, together these units form the largest contiguous protected patch of habitat anywhere in the contiguous US or Mexico. Now that sounds a little bit backwards. It's a military range, right? It's a bombing range, literally. They're dropping bombs on it. But I called it a protected area. There's no resource extraction because of the military use. It's used mostly for training like fighter pilots or other kinds of Marine and Air Force pilots. So it's mostly there to preserve that airspace for training. So the impacts on the ground, they're intense in spots, but most of it has very little impact from the military activities. It's a remote place. It's a hot, dry part of a hot, dry state. And so it hasn't gotten a lot of research in the past. And we're able to add a lot of new knowledge through our work there. I wanted to throw in this quote. It's been kind of a dangerous and intimidating place for a long time. This is a quote from William Hornaday. He was one of the early curators of the Smithsonian, the National Museum. Worked at the Bronx Zoo as well for a while. And he did some work in Pinacate. He never actually made it to what we now know as the Goldwater Range, but he worked very nearby. And he wrote about it from a distance. He said, "Northwestward along the boundary, beyond the Tool Desert floor, and its cheerful stand of creosote bushes, rose the scowling mass of the awful Tinajas Altas Mountains, where the water is little and bad, and many a poor traveler had died of thirst and heat." And that sounds very dramatic, it is, but it's not an exaggeration either. There was a really major route taken by, since the first Europeans, even before that, this is an important route between kind of the reliable water around Sonoita getting across to where Yuma is. But the water was so scarce, it was really kind of just, it was a really treacherous journey to make it from one little tinaja to the next. On all of the Goldwater Range, there's no flowing water, there's no real permanent water. There's some tinajas that hold water for part of the year. If you put all of them together on this whole area, nearly the size of Connecticut, it would probably be less than the surface area of this room, probably less than half. There's just not very much water out there at all. So it was a treacherous journey to get from one point to the next. These Tinajas Altas Mountains in the Goldwater Range, they're named for one set of those tanks, one of the most reliable water sources. And around the time Hornaday wrote this quote, around the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were graves of about 120, 130 people around those tanks that either didn't quite make it, or maybe they got there, but it was the only place. It was a really good place to be set up if you wanted to rob people, for example. Anyways, that's a lot of history, and I won't go much farther into that history. I just wanted to kind of give the setting that this is a really hot, dry, dangerous place, and that's part of why there hasn't been a lot of research there. Other reasons are it is a military training base. A large part of it is actually open to the public. You might not expect that, but it requires a permit. That permit requires a background check, and so it's not easy to get to. You can do it if you wanted to go down there and visit. You just have to submit your application, your background check in advance. It's also right on the Mexican border, and so along with most of our border with Mexico, has some of the risks associated with that as well. So there is illegal drug running, there is illegal immigration in the area. Both of those have been reduced over the last few years, but we still see signs of it. It's still a presence. So all of this combined means that the Goldwater Range itself has been very infrequently visited over the last, forever. It's never been like really a hotspot, especially for biologists or researchers. Despite all that, there's actually quite a bit of recent research that's been done there. But all of that recent research has been done either on a single species at a time, like Game and Fish has a really extensive program studying the flat-tailed horned lizards that are found there. It's a really narrowly distributed species. We want to make sure that, that they're not becoming endangered because their range is so small. Or there have been studies done on the whole community, but at a very small spatial scale. So like there's one 5-mile long road that's paved. All the rest is just dirt roads on the Goldwater Range. That one 5-mile long road has a really good community study of the amphibians and reptiles that are there. But our project is the first attempt to look at the whole range and figure out what's there and where is it. And so we're now starting year 3 of a 3-year project. We're funded for 3 years for this. And that's our goal. It's pretty straightforward. And as a naturalist, as someone who just loves to go out and see animals and look for critters, or birds, reptiles, mammals, I like it all. This has been like a really fun job to be doing. I want to give you a little bit of background on how we go about doing this, how we try to figure out what's found there. So first, I want to say we're studying those 3 groups, amphibians, reptiles, and small mammals. put small in quotes here because we realized early on in the project that and most people think of small mammals, they think of something that you could hold in your hand, like a mouse, a little rodent, something like that. But for very little additional effort, we could just use a little bit of different trap and get larger things as well. So we could get a lot more info without spending a lot more money or effort. So when I say small mammals in this talk, what I'm talking about is everything up to a 10 kilogram adult weight. So I'm including things like jackrabbits, badgers, foxes, but I'm not including like the large game animals. So I'm not going to be including bighorn sheep, pronghorn, deer. Game and Fish has separate programs focused specifically on those game animals. In order to try to cover kind of the seasonal variation in when these species are active, try to make sure we get the whole community, we sampled in 3 5-week seasons each year. So we've done about 30 weeks of work so far. We've got 15 more weeks coming this year. And we use 2 general kinds of approaches. We use visual encounter surveys to find these things. That's a fancy way of saying we walk or drive around and we look for them. I mean, we're not just looking, we're looking in certain places at certain times, but effectively that's what we're doing, is we're just looking for things. And we use trapping. We use trapping for the reptiles and for the mammals. I'll talk about the specifics of the mammal trapping a little later, but this is a Sherman trap. I want to show that now because I don't have a picture of it later. It's about this big. It's a metal box. It's a live trap. So a rodent goes in there to try to get some seed we put in. The door closes behind it. And then we can open it up in the morning and see what's in there. For the reptiles, to trap the reptiles, we built these things we call drift fences. This is a 100-foot long strip of silt fencing buried into the ground about a foot. And the way it works is it's very simple. It's not trapping anything in the fence itself. It's not even attracting them. It's just to kind of block where they're going. So as a snake is out there moving across the landscape, doing its snaky thing, it hits the fence, can't go straight through, so it follows the fence one way or the other. And then along this fence, we've got, you can barely make it out, there's a little box trap here on each end and on each side. So there's 4 box traps on a fence. These box traps are kind of like, you could think of a lobster trap or a crab trap. They're not pinning the animal at all. It just goes in this inverted funnel, and it's a lot easier for the animal to go into it than to find its way out. And then about 1/3 of the way and 2/3 of the way down this fence, we've got buckets that are buried in the ground. These are 5-gallon, we call them pitfall traps, but it's just a 5-gallon bucket buried underneath that fence. So that's 2 different ways that an animal can run into that fence, goes either towards the box traps or towards the buckets, and will wait there for us to find it in the morning. These are all live traps. We have ways to close these up. We can put lids on the bucket. So if we're not out there actively checking, at least every 12 hours, we close them up so nothing can get caught in there. We've also spread these out over 5 general habitat types that are on the range. The first type is the dunes. There's some pretty extensive dune systems out there. They're really pretty, and they hold a couple pretty special species like fringe-toed lizards. Washes are pretty self-explanatory. These are the only place where the water really runs. But they're significant not just because there's water there, a couple days out of the year at most, but because the vegetation is different there too. You've got palo verdes, you've got ironwoods. This is habitat for a different community of species. Get more things like ornate tree lizards or desert spiny lizards. Tend to find them just along these washes because they live in those trees. Foothills, you could call this Upper Sonoran Desert. You could call this Bajadas. This is kind of your typical desert scene with saguaros, cholla. Creosote flats is our 4th habitat type. This is kind of a monoculture. This is also the Lower Colorado River subdivision is another name for this habitat. Tends to be pretty much just creosote, not a lot of topography, not a lot of vegetative diversity. And then finally, you can see in the background here is one of these mountain ranges, kind of like the Tinajas Altas that I described at the beginning. All these mountains on the range are really steep, really rocky. We define mountains, we define all of these by really specific vegetation criteria, but those in the field, when you're just trying to figure out where you are, you don't really need those. Our rule of thumb is if you're using your hands to get around, you're in mountains. Here's another view of mountains. This is also in the Tinajas Altas, with those creosote flats down beneath, probably a little bit of foothills at that transition there. In addition to doing a lot of our own trapping and surveys for these animals, we wanted to collect data from as many existing sources as we could. And so we also gathered data from citizen science projects. A lot of you might be familiar with eBird. HerpMapper is kind of like an eBird for amphibians and reptiles. iNaturalist is another citizen science project that gathers data from any taxon. You can put plants in there, or birds, or amphibians, insects. There's not a lot available on citizen science projects because, like I said, not a lot of people go to this place. But we wanted to make sure we take advantage of all the resources we had. We used our own heritage data management system. This is Game and Fish's database from our own previous work. It also includes any scientific collecting permits we've issued to people. And then VertNet is a collection of over 160 museum catalogs. So this is research collections at universities around the world. This allowed us to incorporate especially some older records from the really early collecting expeditions. And I say, and others. So we also just asked around, like the range managers, the range wardens that work for the Marine Corps. They'd seen some interesting things and some neat places. And basically any source, anyone we could talk to. And if you have information from there, maybe someone here has been there. We need a precise location and a photo, but if we've got, records that we can use, we're taking all the data we can get. So for our visual encounter surveys, we did a lot. We did over 1,210 individual surveys, totaling 19,000 miles. Some of that's on foot, some of that's on car. By miles, most of that is by vehicle. 1,800 hours, that time is roughly evenly split, so probably 900 hours on foot, 900 in the vehicle. If you were to go out of this building and get in your car and take a right and drive west until you went 3/4 of the way around the planet, that's the amount of surveys we've done out there on Goldwater. And it's been successful. We've found over 3,000 individual amphibians, reptiles, or small mammals on the range. We've also done a lot of trapping. So we did 84 trapping grids for mammals. I showed you that Sherman trap earlier. We put those in a 7x7 grid, so it makes 49 traps. We put 5 of these tomahawk traps. These are kind of like a have-a-heart, like a live trap you might use for a raccoon or a cat. Put 5 of those with the 49 Sherman traps, and then we check those every night for a week, for a work week, so it's like 4 nights. So we did that 84 times. We've got 84 grids out there. That's a total of over 11,000 trap nights. A trap night is just one trap set for one night. And this resulted in 559 mammal captures. This map shows the location of all of those trapping grids, color-coded by those 5 different habitat types. These aren't random in a statistical sense. We're not throwing a dart at a map or using a random number generator, but they are kind of random in the sense of trying to cover as much of the range as we can, and also specifically targeting microhabitats that look like they're going to be productive. So we're targeting places that maybe sometimes have a little more vegetation, sometimes they're at a transition zone. Anything we can do to kind of catch more. We're not trying to make statistical inference about abundances. We just want to know where things are. Those reptile drift fences that I showed you, we built 32 of those. The mammal trapping grids are only out for a week, and then we pick them up, take them back to headquarters with us. These drift fences are more permanent. They require digging a trench into the ground. We have to have archaeological clearance before we do that. So these stay in the ground, but we've built 32 of them. They're still out there. They've got signs that say, please don't disturb, that people don't always follow the sign. But they're out there, and we've operated them for a total of 379 fence nights. They've also been productive. We've got 332 reptile captures with these. Here's a coach whip eating western whiptail in one of our funnel traps. And although we built these to target reptiles, we get mammals in them sometimes also. We've got 75 mammal captures with these. In total, we found 64 species. And I'm not going to have a chance to go through every one of them individually. I'm going to kind of scroll them past here. You can look for your favorite or just be awed by how many we found. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are SGCN species. That means that Arizona Game and Fish has determined them to be species of greatest conservation need. We've got 4 amphibian species, 36 reptile species, and 23 mammal species so far. Really big diversity. There's a diversity of habitats there. It's a big area. I think it's still a testament to the amount of work that my crew has put into this project to see such a long list of so many species. I'm going to kind of zoom in on a few examples. I forget exactly 5 or 6, something like that. And I'll first start with a common side blotch lizard. This is kind of an introduction to how we're showing our data to the partner, to the Marine Corps. You might know this species. It's very widespread. It's very common. It's probably the most abundant lizard in Arizona. We find them almost everywhere we look. You can see they're kind of spread all over the range. I don't know if you'll be able to make out these colors. There's some blue dots. Those indicate where we found them in a drift fence. The green dots are where we found them on a visual encounter survey. Yellow dots are incidental, so that just means we were doing something else when we found it. Maybe we were on our way to check a fence. Maybe we were just hanging out at camp, cooking dinner, something like that. And then these kind of reddish-orange shields, those are additional records that we got from other sources. Speckled rattlesnake is a really interesting story on the Barry Goldwater range. We found them in all 4 of the major ranges. So these are the Mohawk Mountains in the kind of upper right, Copper Mountains here in the middle. And this looks like one range, but it's 2. This northern part is the Gila Mountains, and the southern part here is the Tinajas Altas Mountains. The Tinajas Altas Mountains are made of this really white granite, and the speckled rattlesnakes of just this mountain range have evolved a very white coloration to match those rocks. And if you go even just here into the Gila Mountains, they look completely different. So this is what a speckled rattlesnake looks like anywhere else in Arizona. I could have taken these in the Gila Mountains. They can range, they can be kind of pinkish red, like the one at the bottom left here. They can be kind of more bluish, some more blue than these examples. But they're kind of a mottled, speckled rattlesnake species. In the TAs, they're this almost white color, this really bright color. It's really unique. It looks like bad camouflage on this background. This one's resting on some dead vegetation. But when you see them on the white granite, they really blend in pretty well. It's really neat. It's a pretty special species. This species is, you might not imagine anyone would want to keep a rattlesnake, but people do. And I've been told that these go for thousands of dollars on the black market. It is illegal to collect them from the wild to sell, but it does happen. And so one of my colleagues is working specifically on this species in the Tinajas Altas to try to get a sense of what impact collection is having on these populations. It's just another close-up of that really good matching. Even the speckles seem to match the speckles of the granite there. And just one more. I just really love this snake. If you look closely, you can see that we've painted the rattle black here. That's part of that study. So it's allowing us to kind of estimate how many are there by marking them, letting them go, and then seeing how many marked ones we find later. The variable sand snake is another cool story that we found. This is probably our biggest surprise, what we found out on the range. Variable sand snakes are, they're mostly in central Arizona. If you go from kind of the greater Phoenix area extending down to the Mexican border, they weren't really well known from the western part of the state like this. In fact, for all of Yuma County, there were only 2 specimens previously known. So we really didn't know how many there are in the area. We don't know where they're found in the area. We found 7 of them so far, versus 2 in all of history, basically, before that. They're very sand-adapted species. They tend to live in very loose sands, not necessarily dunes. In fact, we haven't found them in dunes yet, on the Goldwater Range at least. But they're found in these major washes where there's loose sand. It's kept loose by when the water flows. So here's a range map. This is from a California Herps website. I didn't make this map, but you can see those 2 dots in kind of the corner of the state. Those aren't just populations. Those are the 2 individuals that we knew about before this project. And so we've kind of filled that in a bit. So we kind of know that it's not a huge surprise. We didn't extend the range hundreds of miles, but we got a little more information about where this species is found. This species is really cool. It's sand adapted, and so it's got this kind of countersunk jaw where the upper lip kind of hangs over and the lower lip is inset. And I don't know if you guys are familiar, but it reminds me of Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. I should talk about a few of the mammals. I just picked out kind of one common one and one rare one to highlight. This is a Harris's antelope squirrel. This is a very common species, but it's also a species of greatest conservation need for Arizona because almost all of its range is in Arizona. It extends a bit into Sonora. Otherwise, it's nearly endemic to the state of Arizona. So it's common, it's widespread in Arizona, but as a state, we're responsible for this species, you could say. We found them pretty commonly. We don't get them in traps very often. All our trapping is done at night, and this is a diurnal species. We do still get them once in a while. We've changed the color here, so the red dots, well, we haven't changed it, but the red dots are the mammal traps. So you can see a few red dots. I think we got them in traps 4 times, something like that. We usually get them on visual encounter surveys. And then contrast that, Arizona wood rat is a pretty rare species. Like the Harris's antelope squirrel, it's nearly endemic to Arizona. Its range does not extend far beyond the state boundaries. It's also one that we're still kind of learning about. This was lumped with another species until, I think about 8 years ago. It's a complicated taxonomic history. So it was considered the same as the desert wood rat, then it was different, then it was the same, then it was different. Now they've got a really extensive genetic background on top of morphology, skeletal morphology, habitat, range. So we're really sure now it is a separate species, and it's one that's only found in Arizona and a little bit of Sonora. So we get these, it tends to be in the highest parts. If you know wood rats, we get a lot of white-throated wood rats. I haven't shown them here. That's a much more common species. This Arizona wood rat is harder to find. It's less abundant. One of the main things the Marine Corps is worried about is managing non-native species, invasive species. And they've put a lot of effort into controlling non-native plants. There's a mustard there that's very invasive. A few other plants that they're keeping close tabs on, trying to control. So they're really interested in hearing what non-native species we found. We have good news to report. We found 2. That's bad news, I guess. But neither one is what I would say like a top-level concern. We found one house mouse. This is the same species you might get in your house. We got it in a pitfall trap, and it was during one of the largest exercises on the range. I mentioned that range is mostly empty, it's mostly used for airspace. There's 2 exercises each year where they just bring out a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of equipment. They're doing test firings, they're doing a lot of training with lasers, so they're shooting but not with live fire. That same week, we found this little guy in a bucket not far from a road. And so I suspect it's not an actual established population, but it bounced off the back of a personnel carrier or a tank or something like that. Rio Grande leopard frog is definitely there, definitely established. There's only one tank, the Baker tanks. It's a natural tinaja, holds water all year, most years, and they have moved on their own naturally. They've been established in the Gila River for a long time. And this Baker tank, it's right at the northern edge of that Goldwater perimeter. So we think that they spread naturally from the Gila River. It's only 3 or 4 miles to the nearest irrigation canal as the frog hops. We think they probably made it on their own. It's possible somebody released them there. But because that water is so spread out, like I was talking about at the beginning, I think the risk of them spreading to another water source is pretty low. So they could be pretty easy to control here if that was determined to be a priority, but we don't think they're going anywhere. So overall, two areas to watch, but I don't think either of these are probably a real concern. Along the way, we found some other cool stuff. We're curious naturalists like you are. I mentioned the variable sand snake before. We filled in some kind of more minor distribution gaps. The first western diamondback rattlesnake from the Copper Mountains, for example. The first western thread snake from the Copper Mountains. But we knew that they were to the east and to the west and to the north and the south, so it wasn't a big surprise to find them there. One of our really cool finds is this Sanita, this cactus. You can see this down in Mexico. In the US, the only place it's found is Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. That's the edge of its range until now. We found one on the Goldwater Range. This was quite a distance, over 100 miles from the nearest known population. So that was pretty interesting. Just this one lone old individual. People do plant these, and so that's a possibility you have to kind of rule out. But this plant is 1.5 miles from the nearest road and 6 miles from the nearest building. So we don't think it was planted by anyone. We think this is a natural range extension. And we published a little note about this in a scientific journal to share that information. This is an Audubon meeting, and I love birds, so I had to throw in a little bit of bird stuff. Anytime I'm out there, I'm looking for amphibians and reptiles and mammals, but I can't help but notice the birds sometimes. So I just thought I'd throw in a few kind of neat things. The Goldwater Range here is at the edge of the range for several species. This is the map from eBird. You can see that in kind of the Ajo area, curve-billed thrashers are still pretty common. They get really scarce as you get over toward Yuma, toward the Colorado River. Could kind of say this is probably about the edge of their range here. So we've picked up a couple of those. Both of these dots here are from me. So the only 2 records from Goldwater West were found by us. Gilded flicker has a similar distribution pattern, but the border is just a little farther over. So gilded flicker is regular on the Goldwater Range. But if you go even up to Yuma or to the Yuma Proving Ground area, gilded flicker gets pretty rare. And we've had a few vagrants too. This is a Townsend's warbler in creosote. This isn't a vagrant. They migrate through there normally, but it's always a treat to see. This bird is headed for coniferous forests in the Pacific Northwest. And here he is hopping around, sidewinders and creosote bushes and saguaros. We've seen some neat vagrants. We had a palm warbler out there once. It's a pretty good eastern species. I missed it. One of my friends had a hooded warbler out there last year. It's another really good vagrant warbler, an eastern warbler. I I think one of the weirdest things that I saw bird-wise, I've shown you how dry this place is, right? I think I've made that clear. I was hiking around looking for reptiles and heard that distinctive rattle of a belted kingfisher. I was like, that's a lost bird. And I got to look at it, and he was just flying around these rocks calling. I don't know. It was migration. It was springtime. I think he's just moving through, but not a good place for a kingfisher to find himself. So moving forward, I've mentioned we have one more year of surveys planned here. We're starting that literally next week. We're going to start our next field season. We're going to target some more surveys in specific rare habitats. Grassland is really rare out there. There's some patches of grasses. Grasses can hold some species we haven't found yet, like mesquite mouse. Not mesquite mouse, grasshopper mouse. Mesquite is another habitat we'll be looking for and targeting for mesquite mouse. Nolina, this beargrass yucca. This is a fallen, dead one. I probably should have put a picture of a live one too. This is kind of the only good habitat for desert night lizard out there. If you get up into Joshua trees, they love Joshua trees. You can find them under Joshua tree logs. But our knowledge of the distribution of night lizards on the Goldwater Range is very incomplete. We've only got a few records of them. I think there's more to find if we take the effort to look in this really specific habitat. We're going to do some more statistical approaches. Some of these I've already started, but I haven't presented them today. We're going to be doing statistical models predicting species occupancy and probability of detection. Anytime you go to look for something and you don't find it, from a statistical, scientific sense, it's hard to know if you didn't find it because it's not there or because you just missed it. And so we can use these tools to kind of give the Marine Corps a better understanding of what it means to not find something as they're following this monitoring forward into the future. We're going to also use some statistical techniques to estimate the number of species not yet detected. It's a very similar kind of question, but at the species level rather than the individual level. So we can look at, when you first start doing survey work, you're finding new species pretty frequently. So through time, your list of species is increasing rapidly. The more you do, the more that slows down. So, once you've done 100 surveys, it might take you 110, 120 to add one new species to your list. So we can statistically look at kind of the slope of those curves and make a pretty good guess about how many species we haven't found yet. We're going to develop monitoring and management recommendations. That's the big motivation of the whole project, and I probably should have mentioned that on slide 1. The Marine Corps wants to know what's there so that they can know what to do next. So they can prioritize species for protection when necessary, so they can make sure their impacts are in places that will not negatively impact species that are at risk. They can put them in places that have less of an impact on the animals. So we're going to be developing recommendations for management in terms of like land use, but also for research if there's more questions to answer. And then, of course, we're going to be publishing these findings in the scientific literature when we're done with them. This is a little note that we wrote, just kind of summarizing the work in progress. This is published in Sonoran Herpetologist. I have not nearly done this project alone. We've had a lot of help from a lot of people. This is part of my field crew, but there's over 20 people have helped on this project, and some of them have been there even more than I have. So we've got a lot of help from people doing field work. The Marine Corps has been great about supporting this project. So I wanted to make sure to remind myself to thank all of these other contributors to this big project. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of people to do it. And with that, I think we have some time. If we do, I'll take a few questions. Yeah, the question is if all the animals are released. Yeah, they're all released immediately. We'll measure them. Sometimes we take some photos, especially the ones that are difficult to identify. For the mammals, we give them a small temporary mark. We give them a little, like a wet willy with a Sharpie. We just put a little Sharpie in their ear. It doesn't last very long, but it lasts long enough to let us know if we catch the same one the same week. It wouldn't work from year to year, but if we get it later the same week, we would know. And then we release them right on the spot. Yeah, right where they're found.
Yeah, that sand snake you had, is that Kinactus pelagrostris? Or
No,
it's a species in California?
Yeah, it's not Pelaurostris, it's occipitalis.
It is occipitalis.
Yeah.
Yeah. It looked different.
No, that's not Kinactus at all. That's Chylomeniscus.
Oh, that's
Chylomeniscus. Yeah. But we do also, we get Chylomeniscus, we get the other one as well.
You do get
They're all the scientific names. Yeah.
How do you bait, what do you use for different bait, like for mammals or different things?
Yeah, so for the reptiles, we don't bait at all. Those traps are just passive. They just find their way in because they're moving somewhere else. For the rodents, we use sweet feed. We get it from a feed store. It's a mix of grains with... Yeah, that's right, with molasses. Yeah, 10% sweet feed. We use those, so I said those 5 tomahawk traps, the larger traps where we sometimes get foxes and things like that. For each 5, we bait 3 of them with the sweet feed and 2 of them with canned cat food. Another reason that we do that we put those out there, for one, it was an easy way to get more info, but also if you've ever trapped small mammals, you have a fox or a badger come through, every one of those things smells like a tasty treat, and they're knocking them around, and they're chewing on them, and they're marking them. So by putting those tomahawk traps, we put them at the corners of the grid, that helps also reduce the disturbance to the Sherman traps. So that's why we bait 2 of them with cat food. Yeah, we've got foxes, we've got kid foxes, gray foxes. We get badgers once in a while, ringtails. No quaddies there, just a little past the distribution of their range. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few. Oh, but there are also rodents that are large enough that we don't get them in those little Sherman traps. There's a desert kangaroo rat, is a really large kangaroo rat. We get those more often in those sweet feed baited tomahawk traps. And then the lagomorphs, too, are more likely in there. So that means the desert cottontail and the black-tailed jackrabbit. Yeah, well.
You didn't do any bat surveys considering them small mammals?
Right. Yeah, good question. I meant to point that out at the beginning. Questions about bat surveys. Our group has done a separate, complete inventory of bats, and that was already completed. So, right, we didn't include bats in our definition of small mammals, only because it's already been done. Yeah.
Did the Marine Corps fund a separate survey of birds?
Yeah, questions about would the Marine Corps fund bird work?
Did they already?
Did they? Yeah, they have. I think there's an opportunity for more, and I plan on exploring that with the Marine Corps moving forward. But they've done some breeding bird surveys. They've done some species specific, like they've done some LeConte's thrasher and Bendire's thrasher surveys. There's not yet, to my knowledge at least, a lot of work done on migrant birds or overwintering birds. So I'd like to see more work done there. But they have done some bird work as well, yeah.
Is the impact, other than the military, is the impact fairly nominal? Like there's no cattle out there grazing? I mean, there's not a lot of human activity other than the military?
Right. Questions about impacts, human impacts to the range. The border safety is a big impact. Not just the direct people crossing, but also the enforcement. So Border Patrol makes a lot of new roads, in pursuit of people. Also, I was kind of surprised to learn this myself. I mentioned that it is open to the public with permits. Apparently, in the snowbird community down there, geocaching is a big thing. the range managers have told me that one of the biggest risks that they see in terms of anthropogenic impacts is people driving ATVs for geocaching. They'll see their geocache up on the hill, and they'll just try to drive their ATV as close as they can get to it. So they tell me that's a pretty big impact. Still nothing like some of the ATV use areas you might see where it's intended for that purpose, but those are kind of some of the bigger risks that are out there. In the back there?
Yes, with its enormous land area, does it have any place on the land that is a human habitation of any kind at all? Or is it no people except driving or hiking?
Yeah, there are no permanent questions about any human habitations on the range. Right, yeah, military or otherwise. There have been historically, so there was before it was a military base, which happened around World War II, there was a mine that was very active. Fortuna Mine had a lot of people living there for a little while. They pumped water in all the way from the Gila River. It's quite a ways, I don't remember how many miles. In current times, there's no permanent habitation on Goldwater West. I don't know Goldwater East as well, but in the Marine Corps side, there are a couple structures. There's kind of bunkhouse style structures. So sometimes those will hold researchers for a few months at a time. But there's nobody living there year round. Yeah. Go ahead.
You didn't say anything, or if you did, I missed it, about tortoises.
Tortoises, yeah, questions about tortoises. Tortoises are surprisingly scarce there. We've done 2 years of work. We have seen, you saw those dots for the lizards, We've seen a lot of animals, over 3,000 animals. We've found a total of 1 live tortoise and 2 carcasses. So they are present. We know that they're there, but they must be in exceedingly thin densities.
Is there a fence along the border there, or is there intended to be a fence along the border?
Yeah, most of the border through there has a pretty significant wall. Is it easy for me to go all the way back to the beginning? Or just flip through? I had a picture way at the beginning here of the border. I'm almost there. Here. So you can see, it's kind of funny. This is my friend and coworker Colin hiking down a wash. There's the border fence coming across, and then where it hits the mountains, it just ends. It's just too difficult to put the fence through those steep rocky mountains. So you can walk right around the end there. But most of it, where it's not through the steep rocks, there is a significant border fence there.
What's the metal thing there in the rock? Is it missile?
I asked a friend of mine in the Marines if he knew, and he wasn't sure. I think that it's a flare and not a rocket, but it's one of the two. I'm not sure which. Yeah.
The Sonita cactus you showed there, I've been in Pinacate, and there are patches of rather large areas in Pinacate that have quite a few of those.
That's right.
So
Yeah, if you go,
that's where they stem from.
Definitely. Yeah, the comment was about the Sonita being at Pinacate. Yeah, you don't have to go far across the border at all for them to become pretty common. You can see them along the highway if you're driving down to Rocky Point from Sonoita. They're along the highway.
Yeah, you don't have to go further in than that. They were probably about halfway between the Rocky Point Road and Mexican Highway 2, the ones I saw there. They were large areas where they were quite a few.
Yeah, once you get into Mexico, they're pretty common. Within the U.S., even if you draw a straight line from this Sonita to those ones in Pinacate, because you're kind of going over a little bit as well, it's not straight south, it's pretty far. Yeah. How do you mark the rattlesnake's tails? Yeah, very carefully. No, really, yeah. So what we do is we get a tube. You can kind of imagine like a wrapping paper tube, like a cardboard tube, except it's transparent. It's clear plastic, clear, hard plastic. It's also a bit smaller than that. You want one, we got a whole set, so there's different sizes. You want one that's just larger than the snake's head. And carefully, from a distance with a snake hook, you don't get close to the snake. You kind of maneuver it so that its head goes in that tube. Once the head starts to go in, the snake will often just kind of move in itself. It's trying to get away from you, so it's going to move forward. And the body is thicker than the head is, so it can kind of get half of the way in, a third of the way in, and then you can just kind of hold the body with the end of the tube, and the head is inside that plastic part, and it's totally protected. And then you can do what you want to the tail. Yeah. You just grab the end of the tube and you kind of shake it out, basically. Yeah. Do not try this at home. Yeah.
At least many years ago, there was a road, something Diablo, that went from Morgan Pike clear over to Yuma. Is that still going through there?
Yeah, the Camino del Diablo.
Do they traverse that? Anybody?
Yeah, you can traverse that with the same permit. Yep. That's right. It's still there. Yep. Yeah, just a gravel or dirt road. Still traveled. Been traveled for centuries. Native Americans traveled along the same area. Yeah, it's a pretty famous road, but then that connects, so it goes right past those Tinajas Altas tanks. It goes into Cabeza Prieta, some of the water tanks there. Lots of wagon trains have followed that same route over the years. 49ers, Gold Rush people. Yeah.
Some counties in California have a feral dog population that's increasing. Is that a problem in Arizona at all?
Questions about feral dogs in Arizona. I have not heard of that being a problem in Arizona. Certainly not on the Goldwater Range. I've never seen a dog there.
I've seen as many as 15 dogs together.
Yeah, and definitely in Mexico. Again, like right at the border town, you'll see feral dogs running around. Maybe someone here could correct me. I haven't seen that in Arizona myself.
In the background?
What about collared lizards and any possibilities of geckos besides banded?
Yeah, questions about collared lizards and geckos. Yeah, we do get collared lizards there. The Sonoran collared lizard is found there. We get them not commonly, but not rarely. I would say we've probably got 30 or 40 records of them so far, I would guess. They're never dense, but we see them with some regularity. Geckos, we get a lot of banded geckos. I think it's possible we could get some of the invasive geckos, like the Mediterranean house gecko, on some of the buildings. We haven't really focused a lot of effort on those buildings. Most of the buildings that are there are in use, so we're not really invited to be searching around those buildings very often.
I wonder about leaf-toed geckos.
Yeah, leaf-toed gecko. We definitely haven't had one yet. Yeah. Yes.
Where you're studying an area right next to the Mexican border, is there any interest from the Mexico side in sharing information? Do you coordinate with Mexico Game and Fish?
Yeah, we've been in touch, questions about collaboration with Mexico across the border there. We've been in touch with the biologist, I know the biologists at Pinacate pretty well. And not me personally, but some of my coworkers have collaborated with them to help them survey for lizards on their side. They don't, there's not as many resources for surveys as broad-reaching as this in Mexico, so they don't have the depth of data. We've shared notes and gotten feedback, but there's never been an effort like this on that side.
How often do you encounter people migrating across the border?
Yeah, how often do we encounter people migrating across the border? We don't see them very often, but we do see sign. One time when I was out there, we were checking the mammal traps. So we set them all in the evening, and then camp, and then we check them the first thing in the morning. And we're starting, before sunrise, and this is summer. There's a lot of daylight hours, so I think it was probably 4 in the morning or something like that. We went out, checked the traps, coming back to the truck, 6:30 or 7, and there's a bunch of Border Patrol trucks there. And we said, we just said, hi, what's going on? And they said, oh, we're just making sure it's you. They've got these infrared cameras set up on hills so they can spot people at great distances. And they said, we saw you guys in our camera and just wanted to make sure that, it was someone who's supposed to be there. We said, yeah, it's just us. We're out here checking our traps. And they said, oh, okay, and there's 4 of you? Like, no, there's only 2 of us. So that's how close we've been. So I know that it happens. Other times we've seen, we set our traps at night and we see tracks through in the morning. It's not common, but I know that it happens. Yeah.
All right, should we go more questions? You got 5
Sure.
minutes?
Yeah, one more?
One more.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a rare and famous animal sometimes seen along the border with Mexico. As dry as this area is where you've done your study, it may not be there. Is there any chance you've heard anything about jaguars that cross from time to time?
Yeah, the question is about jaguars. I thought you were going to go chupacabra. We haven't seen that.
If you've seen those, yeah, we want to know.
Yeah. No chupacabras or jaguars yet. The habitat isn't really right. They're more like, they come across more in the mountains that have trees and water. They're not as much of a desert animal. Not impossible that they might wander through. They have huge ranges. They wander widely. Our methods are not very good at detecting them, but a lot of the other people that are working on the bighorn sheep and the pronghorn, they've got cameras set up at some of these tanks. I think if one were to be detected there, that's how we would find it. But no, we haven't seen any, haven't heard of them, and I don't expect it.
It's happened in the past.
Yeah.
Not too long ago, yeah. Rare.
Yeah, I think there's still 2 in Arizona right now that we know of. Last I heard, anyways. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
If some of you have questions for Ryan, more questions, can you stay a minute and
Yeah, sure.
chat? Okay, that would be great. Thank you.